COP27 was held in Sharm el Sheikh, Egypt, from 6th to November 20th this year. Conference of the Parties is held every year to discuss and review progress under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC. The first COP was held in 1995 in Berlin, Germany. COP28 will be held in Dubai next year. UNFCCC is an international treaty signed by 154 countries in a conference held in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, popularly known as the Earth Summit in 1992. In 2022, UNFCCC has 198 parties as its signatory. Originally, the treaty set no mandatory limits on greenhouse gas emissions for individual nations and contained no enforcement provisions. Therefore, it is legally non-binding. It called for parties to agree later on reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. COP3 took place in December 1997 in Kyoto, Japan. It adopted the Kyoto Protocol, which outlined the greenhouse gas emissions reduction obligation for developed countries called Annex I countries at or below the level of emission in 1990. The protocol acknowledged that individual countries have a common but differentiated obligation to reduce current emissions. The protocol's first commitment period started in 2008 and ended in 2012. All 36 countries that fully participated in the first commitment period complied with the protocol. The U.S. signed the Kyoto Protocol on November 12, 1998 during the Clinton presidency. But it was not ratified by the U.S. Senate. The Senate had already passed a Burt-Hagel resolution in 1997 that vowed to reject any international treaty that did not require the developing countries to reduce emissions. Kyoto Protocol did not cover world's two largest emitters, the United States and China. Therefore, it could not work. Even though the 36 Annex I developed countries reduced their emissions, the global emissions increased by 32% from 1990 to 2010. In 2011, Canada withdrew from the Kyoto Protocol. COP18 was held in Doha, Qatar, in 2012. Doha Amendment to the Kyoto Protocol was passed in which 37 countries had binding targets till 2020. United States and Canada did not agree to have binding targets. Russia, Japan and New Zealand participated in the Kyoto's first round but did not take on new targets in the second round, that is, Doha Amendment. COP21 was held in Paris, France, in 2015 where Paris Agreement was signed governing reductions from 2020 onwards. It was agreed to keep the rise in mean global temperature to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and preferably limit the increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. To stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming, emissions need to be cut by roughly 50% by 2030. Each country is to fix its own targets, including developed and developing countries, thus departing from the 1997 Kyoto Protocol that only required developed countries to reduce emissions. President Trump withdrew the U.S. from Paris Agreement in November 2020. President Biden rejoined the Paris Agreement in January 2021. COP25 was scheduled to be held in Brazil in 2019. When Jair Bolsonaro was elected as president of Brazil, he withdrew Brazil from hosting the event. It was then planned to be held in Chile. But Chilean President Sebastián Pinera withdrew in the wake of 2019 Chilean protests. Eventually, it was held in Spain. Now coming to COP27 that was held in Sharm el Sheikh, Egypt, it has been agreed after many years to establish a loss and damage fund to help vulnerable countries hit hard by climate disasters. However, the mechanism to set up this fund has been left for COP28 to be held next year. This was made possible because the G77 bloc of the developing countries stayed united and pushed for the loss and damage fund. The chair of the G77, Pakistan, had faced severe floods earlier this year due to global warming. The US, the EU, and other developed countries had long tried to avoid this kind of mechanism that can lead to further legal liability in future. In fact, US climate envoy Joe Kerry had previously said that loss and damage was not the same thing as reparations. For decades, scientists have warned to limit the temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. This threshold is fast approaching. The average rise in global temperatures has already reached 1.1 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial level. COP27 agreement reiterated this goal. But, the agreement did not mention phasing out fossil fuels, such as oil and gas. It only calls for phase-down of unabated coal power and phase-out of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. Lawrence Tubiana, CEO of the European Foundation, mentioned that the Egyptian presidency has produced a text that clearly protects oil and gas petrostates and the fossil fuel industry. This trend cannot continue in the UAE next year. Frans Timmermans, Executive Vice President of the EU Commission, who is responsible for EU's environment policy, said that no deal is better than a bad deal. Egypt chose the remote resort town of Sharm el Sheikh to keep the attendees away from the real Egypt. Abdel Fattah el-Sisi took power in a military coup in 2014. Hosting COP27 in Egypt was an attempt by him to give legitimacy to his authoritarian rule. He has been criticized by Human Rights Watch for grave violations of human rights, especially of his political opponents. Alaa Abdel Fattah, a writer and activist, has spent most of the last decade in prison. Hussein Bami of Amnesty International said that Alaa has become symbolic of what the Egyptian authorities are doing to political prisoners. Alaa's sister Mona Seif, who has been a strong voice of support for the release of her brother and other political prisoners in Egypt, tweeted in the early October that, the reality most of those participating in COP27 are choosing to ignore, is, in countries like Egypt your true allies, the ones who actually give a damn about the planet's future are those languishing in prisons. Although, developed countries successfully avoided any reference to reparations in COP27, even if in future some kind of climate debt and reparations are agreed, the problem would still remain whether those payments would reach to the downtrodden people who have been affected by climate change in the most gruesome ways. In the current politico-financial setup with many rulers like Sisi, the money will instead go to secure more weapons, build more prisons, fund infrastructure projects that will displace more people from their homes. Egyptian journalist, novelist, and filmmaker Omar Robert Hamilton writes in an essay that the harder question is how to design a system of reparations that does not entrench authoritarian state powers. This should be at the core of COP negotiations between southern and northern countries. Only the ones doing the negotiating for the South tend to be authoritarian state powers whose short-term interests are even more graspingly fragile than those of oil executives. Let's hope that future COPs may bring better agreements for limiting the rise in global temperatures to the 1.5 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial levels by phasing out the fossil fuels. We also look forward to seeing how the Loss and Damage Fund is set up during COP28 next year. Also, as Human Rights Watch argues that the human rights should be considered as part of the criteria before deciding where to host the next COP.